Hi, everybody. So this should be a shorter lecture. We're finishing up our discussion of the principles of design. So let me just get to the slides and we'll see what's happening. I want you to see this slide again because I really want you to know this, that all patterns contain rhythm through repetition, but not all rhythms are patterns. And we saw that from the slides from the last lecture. We saw lots of examples of rhythms, but not examples of pattern. So obviously, now we're going to talk about patterns, and we see patterns all the time. We see it used as decoration a lot, cornices of buildings, wallpaper, clothing, all over the place. And what you notice about patterns is that there is exact repetition of the way the elements are put together, right? So there's no change happening here. It's the same thing over and over again. And there's several primary organizational ideas for patterning, and they all start with a basic unit, or we could call it a cell, that is repeated in some way. And we can make patterns out of virtually anything. So you can see that these two images together are not rhythmic, right? They're two completely different images, but we can put them together and force them into a pattern. And because they're in a pattern, they are now also rhythmic. So they're not rhythmic on their own, but because they're in a pattern, they're made to be rhythmic. And so here's the most basic matrix for making patterns. It's the square matrix. And that's the simple repetition of the single cell over and over again in a simple square setup. And this can be taken further and further. You can see the simple square matrix on the top left. And then on the right, we see some flipping happening. Bottom left, we see some flipping and mirroring, and the same on the bottom right. So you can see we expand from the basic square matrix to make more and more complicated and often more and more interesting designs. So we can get even more complicated and do something like bricking and half dropping. So up at the top, you see bricking on the left. Lower than that, and the center left, you see half dropping. So that means that you've got a row up and down of one pattern. And the next row over, the next column over, you drop that down half a cell. It's the same pattern repeating, it's just dropped down a layer, a level. Top right, we've got twisting happening. To the far right, we've got stacking and layering happening. So this is the same pattern, the same cell being stacked on top of itself over and over again to create a more complex pattern. So here's an interesting pattern created by a student in the Art 110 class, that's two-dimensional design. This is actually an example of half dropping. You can see that the way that the lines of the mountains come off of the sides of the basic pattern, they come off at the thirds. So she can take that and drop it down a third of the way, and the mountains will connect up to the next mountain range and make this pattern that looks like a mountain range. And it's not the same repetition over and over again. It's the same repetition, but it's half dropped down. So it makes a more complex pattern. The diamond pattern, this is a variation on the square. So just turn a square on its side and you get a diamond pattern. Here's a diamond with flipping and mirroring happening. Here's another similar idea to the last example we saw of student work. Here you can see that one side of the basic cell has a design coming out at the halfway mark, while the other side of it has the design coming off at about the third. So there's two coming off at the third and one coming off at the halfway point. And so she was able to connect up all these lines and keep this pattern going by twisting the pattern around till it makes this complex pattern that also creates another pattern out of the drawing happening within it. And you can see that original cell down at the very bottom of the slide. So that original cell does not have to be a square. This is a student work. This is done all in pen. This is really incredible. You can see the original cell down at the bottom, and then the way it has to fit into itself in order to make the new pattern happening up top. So we've got a lot of flipping of positive and negative space happening here. A lot of interesting things happening and complex patterning happening from this original cell. We've got a derivative of the diamond pattern. It's called the OG. And you see it in works like this. It's a more organic structure. And what has to happen is that the S shape of the side of the original cell has to match up with the S shape of itself, essentially. So it has to perfectly blend with its own sides. So you can see how that's then repeated, in this case, in a half drop way. Here's an OG. A hexagon works as well. You can see how this one's really cool. Hexagon placed in there, and then all the complex shapes made up by the adjoining colors. Here's another hexagon. Really cool puzzle piece sort of design. Another example of the complex original scale. This is another one done in pen. And you can see how that's been repeated over and over again. So it's actually a square matrix. So we've got the same repetition happening over and over again. It's just that the original cell is so complex that it makes this very interesting as a pattern. The original cell is not a square, but it uses a square matrix to make this pattern. It's another interesting original cell. I liked the way this one activated the negative space through the middle. Here's another one where she really had to pay attention where the lines were going to come off the original cell so that they would meet up with each other when they joined the rest of the cells. So you might go about this in a way like this. And one of the projects we do is a more complex original cell using color. And you might start off with a bunch of shapes cut out and play around with how they are organized. There's Chester. And so you would play around, figure out how you're going to combine them into one shape. And so that's the shape I came up with and glued it all together. And then you make multiples of that shape. And you make a whole bunch of multiples. Bunch, a bunch, a bunch. A bunch more. And then when we're doing patterns, we set up these grids on the paper so we can know how everything needs to fit apart in straight lines in order to line up with itself. Glue on the back, starting to glue them down. And this you can see would be part of the completed pattern. The pattern is facing to the right from on the left-hand side, and then it twists all the way around, and then it twists again back to original, and then twists around, and then down on the bottom it flips, and it would continue flipping and twisting all the way across the bottom. And then you would see something, here's a student work, you would see something like this. You'd end up with something like this. I particularly like how she used some collage in this collage pattern. Um, it throws in some variety into the work, and variety is very important in work, and we'll see that in a few minutes. Um, it keeps the viewer engaged a lot, and so by having the text on the newsprint in a little bit different spots on each of the cells, it kind of keeps some interest going throughout the pattern. And then the pattern itself is really great. This I'm just showing you because when we look at composition, we'll look at the word anomaly. This is a little bit more rough of a pattern because this is done with lino cut printing, so linoleum block printing. And it's really, really hard to get it right. So this one's a bit rough. You can see how the original cell, top left, rotates around, rotates around, rotates around, and rotates as it goes throughout the whole design. And then the center has the anomaly happening. Okay, finally, the most important of the principles is unity and then variety included. So unity is the sense that all the elements and the arrangement and the use of the principles all feel whole or congruent. So they feel like they don't need more to create the work. It feels contained and in and of itself. Variety is the sense that there's enough change within those characteristics to yield interest. So sort of like the the slide we saw before with the collage happening, there was some variety in there, and that kept your interest going. So we could say that this work is unified by its color scheme, the shape of the mark making, and the sense of movement. So we could say this has got a lot of rhythm in it because all the marks are made in sort of the same way. And it feels unified because it's got certain colors that are used over and over again, and it's mainly white across the top. It doesn't feel like we need to add more or subtract out to feel like this is a complete work. So the variety comes in the changes in directions of the marks and how colors are placed in different locations. And then there's this sense of movement flowing throughout the entire picture. There's a very unified piece by Joseph Albers. Albers is known a little bit, well, I guess equally as much as a color theorist. Um, I think I mentioned him when we talked about color. Yeah, the slide where we looked at how different colors can be made to look the same and the same color can be made to look different. So we've got a very unified piece happening here, pretty much an analogous color scheme happening. Everything's unified, same shapes are being used. A little variety thrown in with that orange being much deeper than the other oranges and yellow. And so it feels like a whole work. And part of the thing that made works like these whole feeling is that they're like life size. They're bigger than you. So when you see the work in person, it's larger than you, and so you feel like it's encapsulating you. So it feels like this whole being. Why is this slide in here? Oh, weird. So I guess I'm just showing that there's variety happening in the negative space. But you guys know this is from a few lectures ago. There's definitely unity happening here. And there's a lot going on compositionally that we'll look at next week. Um, but the slide I wanted to show you is this one. A lot happening here with the way shape is made that makes this feel unified and whole. The shapes are all very rounded, right? And the negative space shape is also very rounded. The whole figure feels like it flows unto itself. So this whole thing feels very contained. It feels like it is one singular work of art. It's very direct, but at the same time, it's soft. So it feels like it's complete. It feels like it's unified. So this is interesting. So this is both unified and a lot of variety happening. We might say that it's unified by the geometry that's happening, kind of holding everything together, and the color work. The color is all sort of pastel, kind of bright pastel color work. Um, you see very little use of black in the Sistine Chapel. Um, Everything feels like it goes together. The narrative all fits together. You can see that there are connections from one scene to another in certain places. But then, like I mentioned, there's variety. Each scene is a little different. Each scene has different dominant colors, different shapes that are dominant. Some works don't want unity. So the Dadaists tried to make work that was disharmonious to show the condition of mankind. Um, I mentioned the futurists when we were looking at things a while back, but the Dadaists were the whole other side of what the futurists were trying to do. After World War I, the artists in Germany in particular thought that the world was screwed up, because it was, and they thought all of this progress that society had been making is what led to war. So they wanted to make art that was about randomness and not progress. So a lot of collage work started with the Dadaists to throw in randomness into what could be in the image. Dadaists were the ones who would cut up, words from a dictionary, throw it into a paper bag, shake it up, then dump it out, and then glue the words down as they dumped out, and that would be a Dadaist poem. They did similar things with music. And so with Dadaism, we see a definite attempt to make the image jarring, right? It's not supposed to feel real unified. It's supposed to be pure variety and sort of in your face because of that. So you can see there's a huge difference between something like this and the Joseph Albers square as we looked at before. So the Joseph Albers pieces were very unified and very sort of glowing and enveloping, while this piece really screams at you. This is really interesting. What Osorio is doing here is making complete variety, and what is intended for you to do from that variety is then piece together a more unified narrative in your mind. So the work itself is all variety. What it's supposed to do in your mind is cause you to create narrative that is then unified. So what I want you to do then is watch this video about Osorio. And I think it's about the first half that is really relevant to us. But if you want to watch all of it, you certainly can. So we will be back with composition next. I will see you then.